The twin suns beat down hard on the cracked desert of Taraxis IV, a dry, dead place where even shadows dared not linger too long. The sky above screamed with fire as ships exploded mid-air, debris raining like deadly confetti across the red cliffs. One of those falling crafts spun out of control before crashing into the sand with a bone-shaking boom, the metal groaning as it split open. From the wreckage, a single figure crawled out, Private Lanameric, a human field medic with blood on her face and dust in her eyes. Her shoulder was torn open by shrapnel, but she barely noticed it. Around her were bodies, some human, others alien allies of the United Free Worlds. The battle had gone wrong. Empire had struck fast, hitting their convoy without warning. Lana staggered through the wreck, smoke curling around her, searching for survivors. A groan caught her attention, a deep, rumbling sound that didn't come from a human throat. She followed it and found a massive shape lying on its side, blood pooling beneath it. It was a Zelari warrior, taller than any man, covered in thick, greenish-black scales. One leg was gone, blown clean off at the thigh. His armor was cracked open along his ribs, and something inside was bleeding badly. Lana didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside him and checked his pulse. Weak but still there. His eyes flicked open, narrow and slitted, filled with pain and fading strength. His name tag read Vareth. Her training kicked in. She reached for her medkit, but her stomach sank as soon as she opened it. The sealant had ruptured in the crash. Most of the contents were ruined. She had no thread, no antiseptic, no working tools. Vareth would bleed out in minutes. She glanced around. There was nothing useful in the sand, just cactus bushes, broken metal, and the heat. But she had grown up in places like this. On Earth, where life was hard and medical help didn't always come, she'd learned to improvise. With shaking fingers, she grabbed a handful of her own hair, wincing as she ripped it out. She twisted it into a strong cord, knotting it like her mother once showed her. Then she snapped off a cactus thorn, its tip sharp and clean. She held it in her hand like a needle, took a deep breath, and pressed it into Vareth's torn flesh. He jolted, letting out a low growl of pain, but she didn't stop. She threaded the thorn through his skin, sewing the wound shut, stitch by painful stitch, using her hair to pull the edges together. Sweat ran down her face. Her fingers bled from thorn pricks. But she worked fast, careful, steady. She didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all she had. Vareth stared at her in disbelief. He had heard stories about humans how they were fragile, soft, reckless. But this one didn't look fragile now. She looked like fire. When she finished the last stitch, she pressed down hard to stop the bleeding, using her body to block the wind and sun. The heat was unbearable. The air smelled of blood and smoke. But Vareth was still breathing. His eyes slowly closed. He would live. Lana slumped beside him, her own body shaking with exhaustion, but her grip never left his wound. She watched the sky, knowing the Empire would be back, but she didn't care. She had saved him. That was enough for now. The heat only grew worse as the suns climbed higher, turning the sand into burning glass beneath Lana's boots. Wind whipped across the dunes, carrying the scent of ash and scorched metal. She crouched beside Vareth, watching the rise and fall of his chest, still shallow but steady. His green blood had slowed to a trickle, her rough stitches holding better than she'd dared to hope. But time was running out. Drones buzzed in the distance, black dots against the sky. The Empire search teams had landed. They weren't looking for prisoners. They were looking to finish the job. Lana scanned the broken landscape and spotted a trail of jagged rocks leading toward a ridge. There, she might find shelter. First, she had to move him. With a grunt, she slid her arms beneath Vareth's massive shoulders and began to drag. Every step was slow. Sand resisted. Stones cut into her knees. Vareth, half-conscious, muttered in his own language, but she kept pulling, whispering to him that he had to stay alive, that she wasn't about to lose him now. After an hour, they reached the cover of the ridge, slipping between tall slabs of rock where the sun couldn't reach. She found a narrow crevice just wide enough to hide them. Both hands dragged him inside. It was cooler there, almost bearable. She propped him up and used her torn shirt to wipe his face. He opened his eyes briefly and gave a weak nod. She managed a tired smile. Then she turned to the next task, protection. Using broken ship panels she had gathered earlier, she leaned them against the rocks to form a crude shelter. The jagged metal kept them hidden from above. She buried their footprints. Then took one of the cactus bushes nearby and crushed it between rocks, spreading its sharp needles along the entry like a trap. As the day wore on, the winds rose, kicking up a thick wall of dust. The skies dimmed. A sandstorm was coming. She worked quickly, gathering stones to block most of the entrance. When the first wave of sand hit, it slammed against their shelter like a wave. Lana huddled next to Vareth, shielding his face with her body. The air grew thick. Sand got into her nose, her ears, her mouth. She pressed her scarf over her face and stayed still, listening to the wind scream like a wounded beast.
Hours
passed. When the storm finally began to die, she peeked out to find the world outside buried in golden dust. The drone sounds had faded, either lost or pushed back by the storm. She didn't feel safe, but it was better than before. That night, as stars appeared above the quiet desert, Lana checked Vareth's wound. The stitches had held. His breathing was stronger now. She melted cactus pulp over a hot rock and used the liquid to clean the wound. He groaned but didn't resist. She smiled and spoke softly, telling him how her grandmother used to treat wounds with tree sap and dirt back on Earth. He listened. She didn't know if he understood, but it helped. Later, while he slept, she sat outside and stared at the stars, her pulse slowly calming. They were still stranded. The Cums were dead. No one knew they were alive. But she had saved them using nothing but her own hair, her instincts, and will. She wasn't trained for this kind of survival, not on alien worlds with hostile skies and enemy patrols. But she'd grown up in places where people fought every day just to eat or breathe clean air. She was human. She was built for hard days. And long nights? As she leaned back against the rock and closed her eyes, she made a promise to herself. She would keep him alive. She would find a way to signal their allies even if she had to bleed for it. She would not let the Empire win. Not here. Not now. And not while she could still move. The next morning brought silence, heavy and strange, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Lana opened her eyes slowly, her body aching from sleeping against stone. The sky above was pale, the storm having swept away most of the smoke. She sat up and checked on Vareth. His skin was still rough and cold, but he stirred when she pressed her fingers to his neck. The wound hadn't reopened. That gave her hope. She stepped outside the shelter and looked around carefully. The sandstorm had covered their tracks, which gave them a bit of luck, but luck never lasted long out here. The buzzing returned this time softer, but sharper. Her heart dropped as her eyes spotted a small dark shape hovering above the wreckage in the far distance. A scout drone. It spun slowly, scanning the ground. It hadn't seen her yet, but it would. Empire tech was always thorough. She ducked back into the rocks and took stock of what she had left. The medkit was still useless. Her pistol had one shot. There was no way they could fight. Vareth couldn't even stand. She looked at him and knew what she had to do. She grabbed her pistol and a cracked mirror shard from the wreck. She slipped out and began climbing the ridge. Every movement was sharp with pain, but she didn't stop. At the top, she waved the mirror, catching the sun just right. The drone flickered in the air alert. It turned and began drifting toward her. That was all she needed. She ran. Her boots hit the sand hard as she sprinted across the open ground, drawing the drone away from the ridge. She didn't dare look back. Her breath tore from her lungs, and the sun burned her skin, but she kept going. A high whine filled the air as the drone locked on. A flash of red light zipped past her shoulder, another missed her by inches. She dove behind a broken rock and fired her only shot. The bolt struck true, hitting the drone in its eye. Sparks flew, and the machine spun wildly before crashing into the sand. But the signal was already sent. She could hear the distant rumble of engines. The Empire was coming. She had bought time, but not much. She hurried back toward the shelter, circling around to avoid leaving a direct trail. When she finally returned, she collapsed beside Vareth, gasping for breath. He opened his eyes slightly and tried to speak, but she hushed him. There was no time to talk. They had to disappear. Lana scouted a narrow crack in the canyon wall nearby, just wide enough for them to crawl through. It led to a natural tunnel, hidden beneath the rock school dark and silent. Perfect. She dragged Vareth again, gritting her teeth against the pain in her arms. Every foot felt like a mile, but she didn't stop. Moved like her life and his depended on it, because it did. By the time she pulled him into the tunnel, the roar of transport ships echoed across the cliffs. Empire soldiers were landing. She pressed herself and Vareth against the stone and waited, heart pounding. Shadows passed above. Metal boots crunched outside. Searchlights danced across the rocks, but they didn't reach the tunnel. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually, the sounds faded. Lana stayed still, barely breathing, until she was sure they were alone. Then she looked down at Vareth. His eyes were watching her, tired but full of something else, respect, maybe, or disbelief. She gave a tired smile and brushed his forehead with a cloth. "Still with me?" she whispered. He blinked slowly in reply. She leaned back, letting the cool stone press against her spine. She had drawn their attention, fooled their machines, and carried a warrior twice her size into hiding. Not because she had to, because she chose to. And in that quiet cave beneath a war-torn sky, Lana finally let herself rest, just for a moment, before she planned the next move. Inside the narrow tunnel, the air was cooler and smelled of dust and old stone, a welcome change from the heat outside. Lana sat beside Vareth, her back sore, her hands scraped raw, but she didn't let herself stop for long. She broke open. The last piece of emergency ration, tucked in her boot, a dried protein bar from Earth, stale but edible, split it in half. Vareth was barely awake, his face pale under his rough skin, but when she lifted his head gently and pressed the food to his mouth, he chewed slowly. She gave him water drop by drop, using a torn strip of cloth to soak it from her canteen. He swallowed weakly. It was enough. It meant he was still fighting. When he dozed off again, Lana crawled deeper into the tunnel with a broken flashlight she had found among the wreckage. Its flickering light barely helped, but she followed the path, hoping for an exit or a safe place to hide longer. The tunnel bent and twisted, going deeper underground. She found signs that it had once been used, old markings scratched into the walls, maybe from smugglers or miners. At one spot, she found an old power cell wedged in a broken crate, its charge faint but still alive. She grinned and hurried back, knowing even a little power could save them. Back at the entrance, she used that energy to reactivate a broken field beacon she had carried since the crash. It didn't have long range, but she tweaked it carefully, boosting its pulse just enough to send a weak distress signal on Alliance. Frequency bouncing off nearby hills. She wrapped it in stones and buried it under sand, hoping the enemy wouldn't detect it too quickly. The next hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional cough from Vareth. Lana kept talking softly to him, telling stories from Earth, how she used to climb rooftops in New Boston to watch the ships land. How she once stitched her brother's arm shut with fishing line when he broke into an old warehouse. She didn't know if he understood, but his eyes stayed on her. At one point he reached out with a clawed hand and touched her arm, not in pain, but with something like gratitude. Later, when night returned, she heard distant engines again, this time. Deeper, heavier, not Empire. She crawled out of the tunnel and climbed high enough to see the sky. A faint light blinked in the clouds. She squinted and saw the familiar outline of a rescue shuttle. It was small, stealthy, Alliance built. Her signal had worked, but it wasn't landing near them. It hovered far across the canyon, waiting for a flare or a clear pickup point. Lana's hope soared, but it quickly turned to tension. The Empire still searched nearby. If she revealed their position now, they'd all die. She ran back into the tunnel, heart pounding. Vareth looked up as she approached, sensing something had changed. She placed her hands on his shoulders and leaned close. I can get us out, she whispered, but you'll have to walk, even a little. Closed his eyes, then grunted and tried to rise. Pain twisted his face, but he pushed himself up, using the wall. His leg was gone, his balance weak, but with her arm around his waist, he stood. Together, slowly, they limped through the tunnel, one shaky step at a time. Outside, Lana used her last flare-red tube wrapped in a waterproof case and pointed it toward the sky. The light cut through the dark like a scream, bright and loud. The shuttle reacted instantly, swooping down low, but it wasn't alone. An Empire scout vehicle broke from the rocks, heading straight for them. Lana gritted her teeth and helped Vareth move faster, her legs burning. The shuttle touched down just ahead. Lion soldiers poured out, covering them with weapons. As she dragged Vareth up the ramp, gunfire cracked behind them. One round grazed her side, but she didn't stop. She shoved him onto the floor of the ship as the ramp closed behind them. The shuttle lifted, dodging enemy fire. A medic rushed to her side. She collapsed at last, her body spent, but her eyes stayed on Vareth. He was alive. They both were. Against everything, heat, pain, enemies, and the storm they had made it. The shuttle soared through the clouds, fast and quiet, its engines muffled to avoid detection. Inside, everything smelled like metal and burnt circuits, but to Lana, it smelled like safety. She lay on a stretcher, half conscious, her side bandaged by the ship's medic. Her shirt was soaked with sweat and blood, but her eyes stayed open, locked on Vareth across the aisle. He was surrounded by a team of specialists, speaking in sharp, clipped voices as they worked to stabilize him. One of them turned to her and gave a nod. He was going to live. That one nod filled her chest with something warm. She let her eyes close for a moment, just long enough to breathe. They didn't speak much during the flight. Everyone was busy, focused. Lana used that time to rest, but her thoughts ran wild. The last few days played over and over again in her mind, crashing in the desert, tearing her own hair out to stitch. Vareth is swooned, dragging him through sand and stone. Hiding from drones and patrols, tricking machines, and finally reaching the signal point just in time. It felt like a dream now, but the ache in her muscles reminded her it had been very real. When the shuttle finally landed at a hidden Alliance field base, she was helped out gently, blinking against the sudden light. The air smelled of fuel and cool metal instead of dust. Soldiers moved around quickly, unloading supplies, shouting orders. She spotted a tall officer waiting by the hangar doors, arms crossed. He had sharp eyes and a tired look, the kind of man who had seen too many battles. He stepped forward as medics helped Lana onto a medical cart. "You're the field medic from Echo Team?" he asked. She nodded weakly. "I am." He glanced at her bandaged side, then at Vareth being wheeled behind her. "You saved a Zellery warrior with a cactus thorn and your own hair?" She blinked, unsure how he knew. Then she noticed the tiny body cam light still blinking on her collar. It had recorded everything. She gave a tired shrug. It worked. The officer let out a soft whistle and shook his head. "You're either crazy, brave, or both." She didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. He rolled her into the medical bay, a clean white room that smelled of antiseptic and warmth. The doctors took over, treating her wounds more gently than she expected. While they worked, she listened to murmurs through the open doors, officers talking about her, techs reviewing the footage, soldiers asking about the human girl who stitched up a giant alien like an old boot. Her story was spreading like fire through the base. Later that night, she was resting in a cot when someone entered quietly. It was Vareth. He leaned on a steel cane, his leg replaced by a temporary prosthetic, his chest still wrapped in bandages. He walked with effort, but he walked. He reached her bedside and sat heavily in the chair beside her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. He spoke first, his voice rough but calm. "You should not have done all that. You risked everything." Lana smiled. "You were worth it." Vareth tilted his head, his alien eyes studying. "Her why?" She shrugged. "Because that's what humans do. We fight for people. We hold on, even when it's stupid." He looked down, his jaw clenched. Many of my kind would not have done the same. She reached out and touched his arm. Then maybe now they will. He nodded slowly. I owe you a life. Life. In Zelari tradition? That means I protect you until my final breath. Lana tried to laugh, but it hurt too much. I just wanted you to live. That's all. We're steadier now. And because of you, I did. My people will hear this story. So will yours. And the Empire will know that a human girl in the desert made them bleed. As he walked away, her eyes followed him, her heart full. She had gone into the fire alone, and come out with a legend beside her. The war was still raging, but now something had changed. A bond had been made. A warrior saved by a medic. A human and a Zellarine, longer strangers. And as Lana finally closed her eyes to sleep, she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't be alone. The news of what Lana had done spread beyond the base, carried first by whispers, then by official reports, and finally by stunned messages across both human and alien channels. Stories told of a young human girl who had stitched a dying warrior, with cactus thorns in her own hair, who dragged him across a deadly desert, tricked enemy drones, and held off soldiers with only grit and instinct.
Oh.
Too many, it sounded impossible. But the footage confirmed it all. Soon, command centers across the Alliance reviewed her mission logs and started calling her what she never claimed to be a hero. Lana, still healing in the medical wing, tried to ignore the attention. She wasn't looking for medals. She just wanted to make sure Varth stayed alive, that maybe they could get back out there and help the others still trapped or fighting. She spent her days limping between recovery exercises and briefings, and her nights watching the stars through a tiny window, wondering if her team had made it or if she was the only one left. Vareth visited often. Though still recovering, he had begun training again, slower than before but determined. He brought her food, asked questions about Earth, and sometimes just sat in silence beside her. There were moments she caught him, watching her not with confusion, like in the beginning, but with something closer to wonder. In one quiet evening, he handed her a small object, a carving made from the metal scraps of their crashed ship. It was shaped like a cactus thorn, bound in a loop of dark hair. She blinked down at it, surprised. You made this? He nodded. To remember what you did, what you gave. She held it tightly. No one had ever made her something like that. Thank you, she whispered. But I didn't do it for thanks. He nodded again. I know. That is why it matters. Their bond grew stronger after that. They started training together when she was strong enough to stand again. First, in short walks, then in sparring drills. The others watched with curiosity this strange pair, a Deathworld human and a Zelari warrior, fighting side by side. There was a rhythm between them, one that didn't need many words. And when a mission came down a recon assignment to extract survivors near the same desert where they'd almost died, Lana requested to go. So did Vareth. At first, Command hesitated. But they had seen the footage, read the reports, and knew better than to argue with results. They cleared them both. As the new dropship lifted off, Lana sat beside Vareth in the hold, checking. Her gear, her pulse calm. He looked at her and said simply, "Ready to return to the fire?" She gave a small grin. I never left. They landed under the cover of night, moving through jagged hills and dry winds. The desert hadn't changed, but she had. She no longer felt like the scared medic crawling through sand. She moved like someone who belonged, who had already fought this land and survived. They found the crashed Alliance transport deep in a canyon, wrecked and half buried. 3 survivors had holed up inside, injured and out of food. Lana patched their wounds quickly while Vareth secured the area. Empire drones were close again, sweeping through the region, searching for signs of life, but this time they weren't unarmed. This time they had each other. When the enemy came, Lana set the traps herself, lines of shrapnel buried in sand, flares placed to draw attention away. Vareth took point, waiting in silence behind rock and shadow. When the first scout appeared, Lana brought it down with a pulse shot straight to the lens. More followed, but they were ready. The battle wasn't easy. No fight ever was. but they held the line together, guarding the wounded and buying enough time for the evac ship to arrive. As the survivors were lifted to safety, Lana stood beside Vareth once more, dust covering her face, eyes sharp. "That's twice now," he said quietly. "You saved lives again." She gave a shrug. "You held the line." "We both did." As the ship lifted away, the desert below faded into darkness. But this time, it didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like something had been claimed. A bond forged not by treaties or politics, but by survival, respect, and shared fire. End. Above them, far in the stars, more people were beginning to understand what one human could do when she refused to give up, even with nothing left but thorns and grit. Back at the forward base, after the successful rescue mission, Lana found herself walking with a new kind of weight, not the weight of exhaustion or pain, but of recognition. Soldiers she didn't know nodded when she passed. Some saluted. Officers called her the girl with the thorn, and a few younger recruits even whispered about her like she was something out of legend. Lana didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to praise, and truthfully, she didn't want it. What mattered to her was that people were alive who might not have been. That she and Vareth had proved something, that trust could be earned. That even in the worst places, it was still possible to stand together. The Alliance Council soon called her to a strategy meeting. Inside the steel-walled room, generals, alien diplomats, and tech advisors gathered around glowing holomaps of the warfront. Lana stood quietly as her footage played again, her dragging. Vareth threw sand, using her hair and cactus thorns to sew him shut, shielding him, fighting drones, and signaling the rescue ship. The room went still when the video ended. One elder Zalari ambassador leaned forward and spoke, his voice deep and slow. "Why did you save him?" Lana looked up, steady. "Because he needed help. Because it was the right thing," the ambassador nodded once. Another officer spoke next, a human this time. "Your actions changed something. Reports say Zellary war units are volunteering to fight alongside humans now. There's even talk of forming mixed squads." Lana blinked. That hit her harder than any metal. For so long, humans and Zellary had fought in separate lanes, divided by distrust and scars from old battles. But something in what she and Vareth had done, what they had shown, had shifted that. Her simple, desperate act had made people rethink what was possible. Soon, she and Vareth were assigned to train one of the first human Zellary joint squads. It was a strange group at first, soldiers from opposite sides who barely spoke the same language, who didn't trust one another's instincts or methods. But Lana and Vareth led by example. They demonstrated drills, showed how to cover each other, how to use each species' strengths. Lana taught the humans how Zellary armor worked, how they communicated with scent and heat. Vareth taught his kind how human tactics relied on flexibility, on fast choices and unpredictable moves. It wasn't easy, but day by day the squad began to move like a unit. In one night session, as sand blew across the training field, Vareth surprised everyone by saying, "Humans are dangerous because they will not break, even when everything else is lost." "I learned that from her." Lana gave a quiet smile and adjusted the scope on her rifle. "Zellary don't stop fighting, even when they're half dead. That's how I knew he'd survive." Laughter rolled across the squad. For the first time, it didn't sound forced. That night, Lana sat outside the barracks, staring up at the stars. Vareth sat beside her, his new leg clicking softly as he crossed it. They didn't speak for a long time. The sky was wide and cold, but not empty. Finally, he asked, "Do you regret it? Giving everything you had, even when you could have walked away?" Lana thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No. I'd do it again. And again. We all have something to give, Evan, if it's small, even if it hurts." He nodded, then held up something in his hand. It was a new, thorn-shaped token, this time made from fused metal and carved with both their names in human and Zellary script. "Then let this remind us. What started with pain grew into strength." She took the token and closed her fingers around it, the sharp edge digging gently into her palm. It was a strange comfort. Their journey hadn't ended. Battles still loomed. The war wasn't over. But something had changed, not just in the way humans and Zelari fought, but in how they saw each other. And deep down, Lana knew. No matter what came next, they'd face it together. Not as strangers, not as allies, but as something stronger, something earned. The morning was quiet when the message came through, an emergency signal from the edge of the Indari Ridge, where one of the last Empire fortresses still stood. The fortress was heavily armed and built into the mountainside, protected by layers of drones, turrets, and a deep energy shield. Alliance forces had tried to breach it before and failed. Too many had died trying. But now, word came that prisoners were inside captives from both the human and Zelari sides. A new plan was needed. Something bold, something unexpected. Lana stood at the edge of the command tent, listening as officers argued over tactics. Most wanted to wait for reinforcements. Others feared it was already too late. But Lana, watching the flickering map and listening to her gut, stepped forward and said, "We don't need to break the front. We need to slip through the cracks." The room fell silent. She explained her idea, using the storm channels beneath the mountain to sneak inside. Old maintenance tunnels, barely wide enough to crawl through, led close to the prison chambers. It was dangerous, nearly impossible, but it avoided the main defenses. Vareth stepped forward beside her. "We'll go," he said. "Her plan has worked before." Command gave them one chance. Small team would go just enough to move quickly, to avoid drawing attention. Lana led them through wind and dust, across jagged cliffs and crumbling rocks, until they reached the edge of a forgotten ravine. From there, they dropped into the dark, narrow tunnel damp, cold and full of the stink of old machinery. Dot! Air was tight, and every sound echoed like a scream. They crawled for hours, sometimes on their bellies, scraping against stone and rusted pipes. The silence pressed on them, heavy and thick. At one point, they had to wait in total stillness as a patrol passed above. Lana held her breath, heart pounding, hand resting on Varys's shoulder in the dark, both of them listening for the sound of discovery that never came. Finally, they emerged deep inside the fortress, behind the main security wall. The halls were empty, dimly lit by emergency lights. Lana led them toward the cells, her map flickering but clear. They reached the doors just as the system started its nightly cycle. When cameras shut down briefly for resets, she used that moment to hack the panel, her hands steady, her breath slow. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, weak figures. Looked up some human, some Zelari, all worn and starved. Lana moved quickly, helping them up, giving water, checking wounds. Vareth stood watch, his blade drawn. Suddenly, a distant alarm echoed through the hall. Something had triggered the alert. "At minutes, maybe less," Lana said, helping the last prisoner to their feet. "Take the left tunnel. To the drop point, our team will cover you." The prisoners ran. Small rescue squad held the hallway, blasters ready. Drones poured in, sleek and deadly, but they met a wall of fire. Lana fought without fear, side by side with Vareth. They moved like shadows, protecting the path, refusing to fall. Smoke filled the air, metal sparked, blood hit the floor. Lana was grazed across the arm, but she didn't stop. She saw a drone angle toward a fleeing child and threw herself in the way, firing until its core exploded. When the last drone fell, silence returned, but only for a breath. A deep rumble shook the walls. Backup was coming. Heavy units. Too much to fight. Vareth turned to her. "Go. I'll stay and block them." She stared at him, eyes wide. "No. We leave together." He hesitated, then nodded. They ran fast and low through the maze of tunnels. The evac ship hovered just beyond the outer ridge, lights blinking through the fog. One by one, the rescued prisoners climbed aboard. Lana helped the last one in, then turned back to make sure Vareth was still behind her. He was limping, his leg damaged, sparks flashing from the prosthetic joint. Ran to him, throwing his arm over her shoulder. Together, they reached the ship. The doors shut, and the ship lifted into the clouds. Inside, as the medics moved to treat the wounded, Lana slumped against the wall, holding Varys's hand. They were both covered in soot and blood, but they were alive. The prisoners were safe. The mission had worked. Later, as they flew back, one of the officers approached Lana. "You've become something more than a soldier," he said. "To them, you're a symbol now." She looked at him and simply replied, "I'm just someone who couldn't walk away." And when she turned to Vareth, who sat smiling faintly despite the pain, she knew he understood. From cactus thorns to storm tunnels, from desert sands to mountain steel. They had walked every path together and, because of that, they had changed the course of two worlds.